Hi everyone, welcome to the sixth week of this course in phonological analysis at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität. This week we're going to begin hopefully talking about the idea of rule ordering, and we'll be working from, as our basis, the chapter on morphophonemic analysis in Hayes' textbook. There's a lot of material in today's handout, so I may actually put off the last topic, our morphophonemic analysis of some phenomena in Brazilian Portuguese, until the next week, but we'll see how long it takes me to discuss all of the material. Just a couple points before we begin. The third homework assignment I will make available on June 3rd. That's contrary to the syllabus, the Lehrplan, where originally that was the date on which that homework assignment would be due. But I think we need another week to discuss more material before that. Good. So first, I wanted to work through some further ideas on phonological alternation, which we've discussed in the past 2 weeks, to provide some more helpful tips and hints about how to proceed when dealing with various types of data that you might encounter. So in most of the cases that we've seen so far, when we've seen alternation in sounds in different morphological forms, and we could create a phonological rule in order to account for the patterns of allomorphy. Mostly it's been the case that we could identify a so-called isolation form, that is the phonological form of a morpheme when it occurs on its own without any suffixes or prefixes or other morphological material. And that isolation form would usually correspond to the underlying representation of the stem. So that was the case with the English processes of tapping that we've looked at, where usually say if we have, for example, an English stem like the adjective bad, there the word final coronal stop in the comparative adjective form. In the comparative form becomes in North American English batter, with a tap here, and here we could write a rhotic schwa. I've written the approximant here. That's not important. The important thing here is that the stop, as it occurs in the isolation form, is there in the underlying representation of this adjective. So normally what we find, or not normally, but rather in the cases that we've encountered so far, when we see a word without any other morphological pieces, without any suffixes, so the underlying form of this comparative adjective, I believe in last week's lecture we saw this suffix, this comparative adjective suffix in English. There we could assume that the isolation form was the same as the underlying representation of the stem. And so other allomorphs of the stem here are generated when other morphological pieces are added that then create the environment for the application of some process. In this English case, by adding a suffix that begins with a vowel, then the environment for tapping is created. And so let's review briefly a few other cases, or I guess the tapping case under number 2 I've just mentioned here. There you see with the same forms that were discussed in week 5, the verbs write and ride, which become neutralized to writing in North American English. Hopefully we've had time in the exercise session to discuss plosive nasalization in Korean, where again the isolation form solution will work. So for instance, the compound meaning squid pickle, ochinachat, when we add the sta, another word in the nominative case, nemsa, meaning smell before that, we see that the underlying stop T at the end of the word squid pickle here becomes nasalized. It becomes a coronal nasal. So the word in isolation, squid pickle, which has the coronal stop ta, shows us what the underlying form of the word meaning squid pickle should be. And just in case it's put into a further phrase with the word smell, nemse, in the nominative case, nemseka, then we see this nasalization. So in both of these cases, the following analytical strategy will lead us to the correct analysis. In that case, we could simply say, to find the underlying form of a morpheme, simply look at how that morpheme occurs in isolation without any other further suffixes, and undo any allophonic rules that you may have discovered by looking for the complementary distribution of sounds in the data. Of course, there are languages, in contrast to, say, English and Korean, in which not every word is multimorphemic. There are other languages in which virtually every word is multimorphemic, and there are no isolation forms, really. So this strategy, in its basic conception, will simply fail in languages where virtually every form of every word is morphologically complex. And precisely when we see allomorphy involving affixes, suffixes, prefixes, infixes, and so on, it's always going to be more complex because affixes themselves are, of course, bound morphemes. They aren't free morphemes like nouns or verbs, for instance. That isolation form shortcut, which we've just discussed here, will never work for affixes. However, as we've seen in our analysis of the English plural suffix, in week 4 and reviewed in week 5, you can usually apply the same strategy that we've used since the beginning of the course in phonemic analysis. You can simply adopt the elsewhere allomorph as the underlying form of the morpheme. Recall that in phonemic analysis, our procedure has been to adopt the elsewhere allophone of sounds that occur in complementary distribution as the underlying representation of the phoneme. So with the English plural suffix, to briefly review, we found the allomorph s occurring after minus strident and minus voiced obstruents, so sounds like pa and ka. We found the allomorph is after plus strident obstruents, after sounds like za or cha. And we found za occurring everywhere else. So that led to the analysis, the underlying form of the plural morpheme in English was simply za, and the other two allomorphs, sa and z, highlight this for some reason, were to be derived by rule. And similarly, with data from Russian nouns, which we discussed a little bit in exercises and in week 5, those present a case in which taking the isolation form shortcut would precisely make incorrect predictions. So if we recall that Russian data discussed last week, there we found that the nominative case form had no suffix whatsoever, but that nominative case form could not be always identical to the underlying representation of the stem because there was a neutralization process that applied to obstruents in word final position. That neutralization process devoiced obstruents in word final position. So the nominative case form without any affixes, which looked potentially like an isolation form, would end up in some cases being different from the underlying form. And conversely, the genitive singular form, which bore a suffix a, that we found was a reliable predictor of the underlying representation of the stem. So just to review that situation, there the genitive case form, the genitive singular, has a suffix a. So if we compare the words for mushroom and corpse, they have different obstruents differing in voicing before this suffix, griba and trupa. And so since these are occurring in similar environments, we can set up different underlying representations for those stops. But in the nominative, without any suffix there, we find the same stop, a voiceless pa at the end. But we want to assume that these morphemes, the stems, meaning mushroom and corpse, consistently have the same underlying representations, but this neutralization rule of word final obstruent devoicing is responsible for the fact that in the nominative of the word for mushroom, we obtain a form with a voiceless pa word finally. And when we look at a bit of data from German, that can be analyzed in exactly the same way as the Russian case. So the data on the following page I've given in a very broad phonemic transcription. So most other allophonic alternations besides the one in terms of voicing of obstruents here is ignored. And in particular, you'll see if you there should be alternations involving the rhotic, which I've simply ignored, and I've just transcribed the phoneme in all cases. So if we look at this data and compare morphologically related forms like the noun bad with the verbal infinitive baden, there we see an alternation in the form of a stop at the edge of a stem. So the noun here looks sort of like an isolation form for this stem, and it has a voiceless ta. In the infinitive, where we find the suffix there we see a voiced da. On the other hand, there are stems like the noun Arbeit, which consistently have a voiceless stop, in this case, a coronal stop. We also had a coronal stop in examples 1 and 2, which don't alternate. This is precisely the same pattern of alternation which was present in the Russian data. We find some forms that alternate, and similarly, examples 5 and 6, and 7 and 8 show the same pattern, where we have some forms like the verb melden, which in its informal infinitive form, melt, or reiten in its infinitive form compared with its imperative reit. There are forms that alternate, show an alternation between a voiceless and a voiced obstruent, and forms that show no alternation, which consistently have a voiceless obstruent. So the fact that the patterns are either voiceless, voiced alternation, or always voiceless. And the fact that only the ones that that we don't find any pattern of stops that are always voiced shows us that it is the alternating pattern. It is the alternating pattern that needs to be derived by rule. In principle, whenever you simply fail to find any alternation in a morpheme, then the most efficient hypothesis is to assume that the one surface form, which always occurs of that morpheme, corresponds to the underlying form. So for instance, since stems like Arbeit and Reit always occur with a voiceless ta, we should assume that the underlying representation for those morphemes contains a voiceless ta. It's only in the cases where there is alternation where there is more than one hypothetical possibility. And overall here, then we can explain these data where for all obstruents, we can find alternations between voiceless and voice patterns. This applies for coronals, labials in 11 through 14, 9 through 12, and velars in 11 through 16. And it also holds for S. Notice we have nouns like speisen, alternating with imperative speis, but beißen, which has a consistent voiceless sa. Then on the other hand, all sonorants don't show any alternations. So those are the data points 25 through 34. So the nasals and liquids never show any voiceless voiced alternations. And so we can explain this phenomenon with the same rule as we found in Russian. The non-sonorant consonants, the obstruents, become devoiced word finally. And again, we can draw the same conclusion overall that we could draw in Russian. The underlying form of the stem is not predictable from forms when the stem itself in the left-hand column is at the right edge of the word. So just to keep in mind, if we had assumed that words like bat had an underlying voiceless T, then we would need a rule to derive the voiced duh in forms where there's a suffix with a vowel added. But that analysis, where we would need a rule to cause the voicing of an underlying voiceless form, would of course would make incorrect predictions. It would predict that we should have forms like arbeiten with a voiced duh instead of voiceless arbeiten word internally between vowels. And so now that we've reviewed this notion that sometimes we can take this underlying form shortcut in order to posit an underlying representation, but keeping in mind that this won't work for all cases, we can step back, pause for a minute to think a little bit about the overall psychology of language and consider what assumptions we're making about how language works, what is occurring cognitively, what assumptions we're making when we carry out phonological analyses in this way. In particular, we're assuming that there should be underlying forms that underlie entire paradigms. So considering verbal paradigms in German here, for instance, or nominal paradigms in Russian, as we've dealt with here, we're making the assumption that all of the inflectional forms of any verb in German, or of cases where nouns and verbs have a clearly related stem in terms of their meaning, that those should have just a single underlying phonological representation. And this means that native speakers should be able to use those paradigms in ways that correspond to what the phonological rules that we can discover would actually predict. In other words, we're saying that speakers deduce the underlying representation of a stem from one member and then apply phonological rules to obtain the surface form of some other member of the paradigm. So if we consider languages like Russian or German, which have these processes of word final obstruent devoicing, then we can ask ourselves an interesting question, which can actually be experimentally tested. So would a speaker, for instance, be able to guess the correct form of an infinitive in German or a genitive in Russian, if they were given an imperative form in German or a nominative form in Russian, bleibt, let's say? And our assumption here would be no, because the surface form bleibt could correspond to an infinitive. Let's consider the German case, either bleiben or bleiben. If the infinitive were bleiben, then we would see application of the word final devoicing process to generate this hypothetical word bleibt. But similarly, if the infinitive were bleiben, then simply nothing would happen, and the informal imperative form would occur as bleibt. So given that speakers of Russian and German possess this phonological process of word final obstruent devoicing, if this is the only form of a paradigm that they know, the only verbal form that they've encountered, then we would think it would be difficult for them to predict whether the stem has an underlying voiced stop or an underlying voiceless stop. And there's at least one interesting psycholinguistic experiment from Dutch speakers who also have the same phonological process. And the interesting result here is that they actually do better than chance. So it's not the case that if they are shown bleibt, that they simply half of the time guess that the corresponding infinitive is bleiben and half the time guess that it's bleiben. They actually show some tendencies to guess what the infinitive would be based on the distribution of sounds in their lexicon. So in Dutch specifically, for instance, there are a lot more instances of an underlying voiced labiodental fricative the in comparison to the corresponding voiceless sound. So if speakers are given, say, a hypothetical infinitive form laaf, and asked to build the infinitive, they would tendentially guess, they would be more likely to guess that the infinitive has the rather than f. We should read here rather than f. So although in principle, the phonological state of the language says that speakers can't have complete knowledge or complete certainty in certain cases, they actually seem to use other information that's available to them to try to make the best guesses possible. So we can know with speakers of Dutch or German or Russian that if they are given the infinitive forms where the contrast in obstruents, well, let's just say Dutch or German because they are morphologically similar in this regard. If they are given fake infinitive forms, so a fake infinitive bleiben, bleiben, or blaven or blafen, they can predict with 100% accuracy what the corresponding informal infinitive would be. It will have a voiceless obstruent word finally. It's only in the case where they have to derive the form which allows for contrast between the obstruents, as in infinitive, from a form which neutralizes the contrast between obstruents, where there's some amount of uncertainty, and the speakers seem to rely on statistics, lexical statistics, about what the most common patterns are in order to try to make educated guesses. So when we come back, we'll begin trying to apply all of our knowledge and analytical techniques to a large set of Turkish data.